for us right away?
Yeah.
Okay. What would you like to play?
I would like to play a Minuet 3 by Bach.
Minuet number 3 by Bach.
Yes.
Okay. We want to hear it.
We sure do.
What do you think about children who might be listening to you and have that idea, maybe I could do that?
Well, I guess they would be very proud of themselves. I guess that would be their very best choice, and they would have fun playing.
Have fun playing it?
Mm-hmm.
You have fun playing it?
Yes.
But I bet it's work, too.
Yeah, a lot of work.
A lot of practice, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. You know what? One day when I was just learning a different piece, I don't know what that was. I just said, I want to learn it right away. I don't want to just have it no mistakes. Well, I couldn't do that. My mom said, nope, that's too hard. Then everybody has to practice before they can learn something.
Before they do it just right.
Right.
And it's okay even when you make mistakes.
Yeah, because you still practice.
The problem with commenting on a phenomenon as large as Jordan Peterson is there's very little I can say that hasn't already been said by one YouTube commenter or another. I don't think it's controversial to say that the Jordan Peterson phenomenon has been somewhat unique. He is, if nothing else, an academic who had a truly meteoric rise to the level of celebrity, to being a household name, and that's not altogether common, at least in North America. For some background, Jordan Peterson was a University of Toronto professor of psychology, largely focusing on concepts of meaning. Jordan Peterson had more or less very little press and very little exposure for the first part of his life, his academic career coming to somewhat of a culmination in his 1999 book, Maps of Meaning. A text that sought to bring sort of a Jungian analysis to symbols and mythology, examining how consistent relationships between these symbols and myths persisted inside human existence, and how they might give some insight into how humans structured meaning, both on an individual and a collective level. However, although I still think it could be said that Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning is his intellectual magnum opus, the man didn't really gain prominence until almost 20 years later. First, in a somewhat quiet way, uploading videos where he carried much the same analysis he put in Maps of Meaning to other contemporary events and sometimes literary tropes. Second, in a much louder and more prominent way, when he took a stand against Canadian Bill C-16 concerning transgender pronouns. I remember first encountering Jordan Peterson when he appeared on the Canadian talk show, The Agenda with Steve Paikin. They're discussing his position on Canadian Bill C-16 and the subject of transgender pronouns, along with several other prominent activists and intellectuals who took the mainstream view that this bill would be more or less innocuous, and that use of alternate pronouns was simply a matter of respecting students and people's quote-unquote rights. Although going back to this appearance, it does seem that Jordan Peterson is quite defensive, speaking in a more reserved tone than in his later appearances. I think people mainly perceived then, and still do now, that he was the definitive winner of this engagement. The activists that he's paired against seem to be vindictive and dismissive, tossing out insults and scoffing at serious intellectual objections, engaging in bad faith character attack that really were and are unsuited, something I think would be a staple template for how the left would generally deal with Jordan Peterson going forward. Still, despite the fact that I thought then that Jordan Peterson got the best of the exchange, and I thoroughly enjoyed the episode of the talk show, thinking that it elucidated some key points about the debate over pronouns, I was certainly not expecting Jordan Peterson to explode onto the public scene the way he did a few months after this appearance. Following further appearances on other large podcasts, most prominently among them The Joe Rogan Show, Jordan Peterson's YouTube channel became the next phenomenon that everyone was watching and talking about. And this was, to be quite honest, astonishing. Breaking almost every rule of previous YouTube, these videos were becoming popular, which were long-form, intellectual, in-depth, and not containing sarcastic funny dialogue, snippy jump cuts, or jokes. Peterson was essentially breaking the form of YouTube, giving modified university lectures in video form, and people could not get enough of him. I remember watching Peterson's YouTube channel, interested enough. His series on the Bible was enlightening and very well done, although I didn't quite finish it in its entirety. I remember being utterly surprised that Peterson was as popular as he had become, and I'm wondering now if I really had the right to be that surprised. My YouTube channel was at this point fairly young, but in many ways Jordan Peterson was responding to many of my own complaints about the hollowness of skeptic and anti-SJW YouTube. Here was content that was ideologically solid, deep, and pointed to a broader transcendent spirituality. In a nutshell, it was everything I was asking for in an intellectual medium, if not in quite the way I had hoped it would occur. Still, despite having no problems with Peterson, I found I had a certain type of immunity to his appeal, and this put me in a sort of awkward position, probably not unlike someone who just didn't like Tolkien or Tolkien-esque fantasy when the Lord of the Rings movies came out. Sure, there's nothing wrong with them. Sure, they are examples of well-made films, but you couldn't share in the enthusiasm your friends had in seeing these movies, even if there was nothing ostensibly wrong with them. Not being an explicit Peterson fan kind of put me in a strange position. Everyone expected me to have an opinion on Peterson one way or the other, and I had frequent requests to make a response video or an analysis of his work. And this was hard because I really didn't have all that much to say about him. And yet contact with his fans, if you were a YouTube or content creator on the right or center-right, was inevitable. Not least of which from my then fiancée, now wife, who took an immediate liking to Peterson. In no small part, I suspect, because she recognized him as a fellow countryman and kindred spirit. Now, I'm not going to claim that personal reasons prevented me from making a proper critique of Peterson, but it always seemed the wrong time and place, even as I began to increasingly feel that a criticism of Peterson was very, very necessary from the right. On one level, Peterson's message was very straightforward and quite unobjectionable. First, there was a recognition of the state society was in to a certain degree, a criticism of far-left progressivism, especially far-left academic progressivism, insofar as it had led to our current cultural state, which Jordan Peterson called postmodern neo-Marxism. And then, moving off this criticism, a call to revivify virtues that had been long left dormant in the West. Young people, and young men in particular, needed to get their lives together, focus on their own virtue, and leave behind all these progressive pieties that were quickly dismantling the public square. It's a nice 1-2 punch, and that followed up by an intellectual analysis of various psychological and cultural phenomenon that Jordan Peterson was very able to do, made the Jordan Peterson package quite attractive to many people. And Peterson was able to take this formula to another book, his bestseller 12 Rules for Life, which, while much less intellectual than his original Maps of Meaning, was nonetheless a financial boon for him. Around about this time also, the left, after waiting and hoping that Jordan Peterson would simply go away, finally realized that they would have to confront the phenomenon of his work and popularity. A lot of people were listening to Jordan Peterson, and he was not portraying the progressive movement in a very favorable light. And so, subsequently, a number of progressive critiques came out against Jordan Peterson. However, these criticisms were quite disordered, leaving aside the numerous attempts to lure Jordan Peterson into an ambush interview, most prominently in his interaction with Cathy Newman of the BBC. The intellectual criticisms of Jordan Peterson didn't really have much of a point to them. Some called him reductionist, even though Jordan Peterson was willing to go on at length about any of the things that he criticized, and would if you gave him a platform. Other voices tried to criticize Peterson's previous academic career, trying to present him as a fraud, although it seemed very few of these critics had actually read his previous academic career. In short, nothing came of this attack. They criticized Peterson for being damaging to important political movements, although this was transparently self-serving. And as always, because this is the modern left, there was the constant assertion that Jordan Peterson was racist, sexist, and homophobic, sometimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly. Indeed, criticizing Peterson from the left was hard, which led to two other frequent common complaints from left-wing critics of Peterson. The first being that Peterson was deliberately vague and obfuscated his own opinions, implying more radical positions than he was ready to own up to in public when asked explicitly about them. The second, quite ironically, being that Peterson used imaginary made-up buzzwords, most prominently among them postmodern neo-Marxism, which he used as a boogeyman. Don't you know, the left would say, postmodern neo-Marxism doesn't actually exist. Marxism is a modernist theory. I always found these two criticisms to be quite hilarious when they occurred in tandem, because one answers the other. Yes, certainly Jordan Peterson does have a little bit of intellectual and academic obfuscation going on. In fact, most people who work in higher education do. When you work in highly uncertain fields in social science and in other soft sciences, you have to guard yourself against being accused as a fraud. Therefore, academics become quite proficient in talking in ways that are very, very hard to criticize. You make up terms that cross-pollinate different and contradictory ideas and still make the terms vague enough so that no criticism can really seem to apply to the intellectual theory itself. Jordan Peterson certainly has taken a page out of this well-known academic playbook, but the playbook was written by the left, and you can see this play no more clearly executed than in the left's criticism about how postmodern neo-Marxism is a made-up boogeyman. While on the one hand it's true, the phrase postmodern neo-Marxist is more or less a neologism coined by Peterson, the two halves of the phrase, postmodern and Marxist, are frequent labels used in leftist academic circles. And it's these very academic circles that we have to thank for identity politics and woke culture in the 21st century. Everyone knows who these people are. Everyone knows the kind of ideology they spread. We're only quibbling about the words we use to associate with them. And in truly ironic fashion, when these academics are meeting in conferences, when they are citing and praising each other's work, they are quite liberal with calling themselves and each other Marxists, and quite liberal in calling themselves and each other's works as postmodern, at least when it's being used in a complimentary fashion. A simple look at any one of their bibliographies will tell this story quite definitively. Both words appear copiously. And if people are just dying for a specific example, my favorite is none other than Counterpoint's favorite author, John Berger. Counterpoint's a popular proponent of the postmodern Marxism don't reel school of leftist criticism of Peterson, certainly forgot to check that their own favorite author self-identified as a Marxist and had been called frequently by others as postmodern. Perhaps not postmodern neo-Marxist all in one word, but I think we're quibbling here. Still, the facile nature of progressive critiques against Peterson doesn't make Peterson right. Still, I couldn't formulate a good critique against the man until in late 2017 when my wife bought tickets to see Jordan Peterson in person on a panel with Orthodox scholar Jonathan Pageau and Bret Weinstein. Now, while I am quite fond of Jonathan Pajau's work, I remember seeing Bret Weinstein for the first time and being filled with a type of disgust. Weinstein, of course, being the ultra-progressive evergreen professor who nevertheless was, wait for it, devoured by his own students when he stood against their latest woke move on campus, was now lecturing an audience of mostly conservative people about how crazy things had gotten in the modern university, how progressives had taken things, this time, a little too far. Frankly, I found Bret Weinstein's persona to be altogether creepy and myopic, something that would be only complemented when his brother, Eric Weinstein, an even more creepy and myopic person, came into the public sphere. Still, seeing him on stage with Peterson gave me an insight into some of Peterson's own blind spots. Peterson, wielding a sort of academic tone and a casual masculinity, was able to stand aloof from a lot of the mistakes Weinstein was making. But in a larger sense, hadn't Dr. Peterson also participated in the same process? He was an academic in the 90s when all of these political machinations were getting put into place. He built the superstructure that was currently destroying the public sphere that he valued so much. And sure, maybe he would even admit to being part of this process. I can imagine Jordan Peterson being pressed admitting that the problem went much, much deeper than just this current crop of ultra-woke student activists. Still though, wasn't this small career myopia on the part of Jordan Peterson not pointing to a larger myopia in his entire worldview? His focus on individual virtue and individual meaning. His use of symbology and meaning analysis really confined to psychology and ethics, and not to larger collective political meanings that might imply some kind of religion. Indeed, there is a thread here that could be pulled. Until, fast forward 1.5 years later, Jordan Peterson met in another live event against an adversary, Slavoj Zizek. Needless to say, there were many things about this interaction that could be commented on, not least of which that Zizek was in many ways to the right of Peterson, much to the misapprehension of the audience at large. Still, one moment in particular I think stood out in my mind, and in many others. No, not the got you where Slavoj Zizek asks Peterson to name the postmodern neo-Marxists, but rather in Zizek's observation that Peterson's own virtue-based approach to confronting the issues of the modern 21st century world would ultimately not work. Individual virtue would not entirely be enough. Collective organization was needed, political change was needed, the system was itself damaged. Now, in many ways, Zizek's criticism was not particularly original. Most of Peterson's critics from the distant right, and sometimes even the alt-right, harped on just this defect. Some critics, even from the left, harped on this defect. Yet, I think the way and the time that Zizek said it put this critique in starker relief, and pointed to a deeper defect that I think Jordan Peterson, and many of the people who call themselves Jordan Peterson fans, haven't quite taken seriously enough. And this is the very simple observation that individual responsibility and individual ethics are no replacement for collective activism and political control. Now, I absolutely do not want to strawman Jordan Peterson or Jordan Peterson fans here. I'm sure that these people would readily admit that some form of political action is needed. But in many ways, the extreme focus on individualism obfuscates the very, very large collective problem, the very, very large community problem that we face as a society, and as individuals trying to exist inside modernity. Oftentimes, I think the focus on individual action is used as a way to shut down a much needed conversation about collective action. But strangely enough, I find that I have a good deal more luck when I simply rephrase my objection just a little bit, putting it in terms of a very Peterson-esque adage. And that adage is simply that company is stronger than will. Your behavior will eventually conform to that of your social group. In fact, this is simply the corollary of one of Jordan Peterson's own 12 rules for life. Rule number 3. But when we take this analysis to its logical conclusion, we will see that a discussion of collective construction and collective activism cannot be avoided at any level through the promotion of individualistic virtue. Human beings are not individualistic islands. They belong to collectives. They belong to communities. If that community is not at some level rightly ordered, the individual will, the individual desire to be virtuous in face of that, will eventually collapse in the main. Christian civilization has always known this, and to point out a quite obvious corollary from the Middle Ages, we can go back to the very monasteries that sprung up in a time of social upheaval. Here, the rule of Saint Benedict was always in effect, even for those who were pursuing a life of individual spiritual perfection and contemplation. Monks had to pursue virtue and contemplation in community, because it was understood that man in isolation was just as able to fall as he was to elevate himself. In fact, due to the fallen nature of man, he was probably more likely to fall. Even for monks, even for sisters and brothers, the pursuit of inward virtue was a collective exercise undertaken inside a community, with authority and with rules. And while there were individual rare examples of very, very holy hermits, those who had achieved great prayer life and great inner peace even in isolation, these examples were extraordinary by definition. Great saints and spiritual masters might be able to retreat into the forest and become godly, but this is much less likely for your average sinner like myself. Telling everyone to be individually virtuous, individually saintly, either in isolation or in a corrupt society, is not in its average operation going to work. Sure, there are great living saints that can accomplish this, but telling everyone to do it is like telling everyone that they can climb El Capitan without a rope. Sure, it's been done before, but most of the people who try it are going to plunge to their doom. But once we confront the need for some kind of collective way to pursue virtue, a collective way to pursue a community that is dedicated to a moral vision, all sorts of non-Petersonian questions immediately assert themselves. We have to ask ourselves, what is the objective basis for determining this moral virtue to begin with? Can any type of individualistic moral vision truly be eternal? And can the purely abstracted notion of God that Peterson possesses really be present enough to drive and vivify a community that is going to seek a very, very hard moral witness? People often treat these questions like they're weird, abstract, academic, or theological, but once we admit the utter necessity of collective vision, they are very, very practical and very, very important to have distinct answers to. And I'm not sure Peterson's vision provides that. But on a more immediate scale, once we admit that collective action is not optional but required, we must confront the issue of organization. And here comes another problem. Inside the present political order, inside the present political progressive mainstream, the powers that be are not neutral or uninterested in the prospect of conservative and non-progressive organizations. They are definitively against them, and they use every opportunity at their disposal to disrupt those types of organizations and those types of collective political pursuit. And the establishment crushes non-progressive collective political action through appeals, in both cases, to individualism. First, in a crude way, saying implicitly that we're all individuals, and any attempt to join a collective and pursue collective interest is a sign of weakness and immorality. It's something that only weak people do to make them feel better about their own lack of achievement. This, of course, being a manifest lie. Most peoples throughout history, most accomplished peoples throughout history, were not pure individualists and worked towards a collective benefit. This pure, crude individualism that you see coming from the progressive mainstream would be totally alien to anyone from the 19th or 18th centuries, even those who had made magnificent feats of accomplishment. However, Oftentimes, when this crudely individualistic attack fails, there's another fallback position that nonetheless relies on individualism to destroy collective, non-progressive organizations. And this is the targeting of leaders, the questioning of their moral authority, and turning loyalty to the institution and collective good itself as a referendum on the acceptability or non-acceptability of one particular action done at some point in the life of one of that organization's leaders. Examples of this abound. Numerous evangelical churches have been brought down by personal scandals among one or many of the church leadership, much to the delight and thunderous applause of progressive onlookers. Still more organizations have been brought down by one or two racist phrases heard from a leader here or there. Such scandals tend to be fatal to non-progressive organizations, but the same thing cannot be said for their left-wing counterparts. Certainly, I don't think anyone is expecting that the Southern Poverty Law Center is going to fold thanks to scandals involving their founder, Morris Dees. In many ways, the election of Donald Trump is a giant repudiation of this strategy, which has been employed cynically far too much by the progressive mainstream. Still, in recognizing these crude and dishonest political attacks on collectivization on the non-progressive or right-wing side, we see that Jordan Peterson fails twice. He has, in many times in the past, played into the notion that any collectivism is merely a cover for weakness and inadequacy on the individual level. And he has even taken one or two opportunities to play into progressive smear campaigns, even though he's been on the wrong side of one or two of them himself. Here, most notably, I think everyone will think of Jordan Peterson's reaction to the Brett Kavanaugh scandal, where an otherwise unproblematic nomination to the Supreme Court was disrupted by a dishonest and possibly fraudulent 30-year-old accusation of sexual impropriety. In typical faux individualistic form, Jordan Peterson suggested that Brett Kavanaugh might consider resigning in order to heal the division that was implicit in his own nomination controversy. This perspective so epically misses the point as to misunderstand the entire nature of the controversy over Brett Kavanaugh to begin with. Brett Kavanaugh's nomination controversy and scandal was not contentious because of Brett Kavanaugh's politics or even the possibility that he committed a non-crime 30 years previously. The controversy stemmed from the progressive establishment's own belief that it could essentially dig up a moral scandal to immediately disqualify any collective political leader from taking power that they otherwise would have had a right to in ordinary operating circumstances, putting not just Brett Kavanaugh's moral witness on trial, but the collectivity of everyone who supported Brett Kavanaugh after the scandal emerged. What truly drove the controversy over the Kavanaugh confirmation was the implicit claim by the progressive side that in supporting Kavanaugh, you were essentially apologizing for sexual impropriety. The attempt at taking political action had been segued onto an individualistic moral examination on the part of the progressive mainstream's enemies, exactly what the mainstream wanted, and Jordan Peterson's comment played right into that. Now, while I certainly don't want to imply that this is a moral failing on the part of Peterson, what it does indicate is an acute and fundamental blind spot that Peterson has fallen into again and again and again. As insightful as he is about psychology, there seems to be something fundamental about this postmodern age that Peterson does not grasp. And if something this fundamental cannot be grasped, it calls into question how effective Peterson will be at taking a movement forward, at truly contesting with a progressive vision as it continues to dominate mainstream institutions. In this context, looking at Jordan Peterson, the man and the phenomenon, as they lived between 2017 and 2019, I think a clearer picture begins to emerge. Jordan Peterson emerged as a critic of progressivism from the Academy, an attack that the left had a very, very difficult time fending off due to its origin. However, unlike previous academic conservatives like Roger Scruton or Robert P. George, Jordan Peterson was much harder to sequester into his own ivory tower, mainly because he started appealing to the one collective demographic that the progressive mainstream truly feared, namely young, disenfranchised men. In playing mentor to a generation of young men that had been fundamentally failed at an individual level by fathers, Jordan Peterson filled a gap that had been long vacant. He provided support and vision, a unification of answers from both a spiritual and academic perspective. Thinking more about Jordan Peterson in his own archetypical fashion, I find it no surprise that he is popular, particularly in evangelical Protestant circles. Protestantism itself having been torn asunder since the early 20th century between evangelical and mainline branches, has been something akin to a body with its head and torso separated. The mainstream churches largely being spiritually dead, unattended, and whose followers have been absorbed either into individualistic liberalism or full-scale into progressive identity politics. The evangelical branches being religiously alive, still lacking the intellectualism and rigor that gives them any kind of validation in the mainstream. These churches having breadth but no depth, a heart but no brain. In many ways, Peterson's witness to these two groups is twofold, being a reintroduction to the academic and intellectual heritage of the West for the average evangelical. He simultaneously could reconnect a secular person who would have at one point been a mainstream Protestant with their more spiritual heritage. In some sense, Peterson is following in the footsteps of the Protestant revival minister, the intellectual inheritor of both John Edwards and Reinhold Niebuhr in his own part. Peterson, in many ways, is the post-Christian Protestant, the farthest point in modernity that Protestantism could progress to without completely losing contact with its spiritual tradition, its spiritual impetus to begin with. In some sense, Peterson is the ultimate culmination of individualistic, modernist Protestantism, and as such, those of that tradition see him as a natural endpoint, as a way to become whole again in their tradition. Perhaps even a way to go back to something that was more authentic and robust. But once more, Peterson's own identity as this endpoint is also his greatest weakness and contains within it his greatest blind spot. Because while Peterson might have arrested modernity's progress in his own soul, while he might individually stand at the precipice just before the forces of progress begin to devour their own substance, while he, in many ways, might embody the Christian ethics of his forefathers and bring them to their descendants in a new way that is useful to their own lives, it still does not defeat the fact that in a collective sense, at a collective level, modernity wasn't and still has not been arrested. Indeed, long have the termites feasted, and almost all of the institutions that this moral system would have naturally fallen back on have been devoured. And as much as Jordan Peterson can provide spiritual insight and surrogate for a father figure at an individual level, it all falls apart when we take a step back and look at things at a societal level. As I've said previously, moralism is not strictly an individual affair. It exists as a covenant between an individual and a spiritual entity or a collective. As such, I don't have a lot of hope or faith in the type of ideology that Jordan Peterson is promoting. It's not simply that Jordan Peterson chooses not to confront the collective problems we face in our society. It's that something about his temperament prevents him from even understanding the problems. And as such, every time I look at Jordan Peterson and Jordan Peterson's fans, I get a sinking feeling. What happens when all of these young men who are following Jordan Peterson decide to take the leap and realize suddenly that there's no one there on the other side to catch them? The institutions that Jordan Peterson has built his entire life around understanding and working within have been corrupted and undermined at a fundamental level. 2018 is not the same time as 1989, and as such, will Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life really seem profound, really seem effective? Without something much, much deeper, the answer I keep on coming back to is most definitively no. And while I certainly don't want to put improvement past the man, the only way Jordan Peterson's message could become truly relevant is if he combined his individualistic call for virtue with a simultaneous denouncement of society and collective corruption, embodying the kind of radicalism that I think we see most clearly in the earthly mission of Jesus Christ, and also in the many radical saints that followed in his footsteps. Now, I think it goes without saying that this is no small order. The combination of a collective denouncement of present society and a simultaneous entreatment to build a new collective, starting with the individual virtue, is something that is very, very hard to preach and even harder to live out. But I think in the case of Peterson, the problem is compounded. Despite the fact that he is very intelligent and very accomplished, I don't think he's been trained to be one of these radical rebels for a new Christian order. He's been trained as a guardian, as an upholder of an existing Christian order, as someone who builds on existing wisdom and teaches it to another generation. And while I think it's unfair to ask Jordan Peterson to embody this radical archetype of revolution simultaneously with his own more considered demeanor, still, I think this deficit of revolutionary spirit will be felt by people who follow Peterson, and will become more and more apparent as the ravages of postmodernity really take root and become apparent. We can't retreat to a spiritual age. The only way out is through, and to accomplish this is going to need a radical vision. A vision that knows how to play inside postmodernity and not just denounce its existence. And in some sense, I think this is a task that Peterson is not up to. As I close this section about Jordan Peterson, I'm reminded by a stupid quote from Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight. In this movie, a contest between Batman, the Joker, and the District Attorney Harvey Dent, there is a lot of discussion over the hero we need versus the hero we deserve. I always thought this distinction was quite stupid. Nolan himself doesn't even really understand the distinction, but every time I think back on the phrase, the hero we needed but didn't deserve, I think to Jordan Peterson. A person who embodies wisdom, but just not a wisdom that's very well suited for the specific time he occupies. In many ways, he's a throwback, a promise that we might be able to obtain a previous age. He doesn't understand at some level that postmodernity isn't really a movement, but more a condition, a language that has occurred once everyone has realized that the established Christian order has crumbled. Peterson is the hero that nobody asked for. He just showed up, and in any previous era, his advice would be more or less mainstream. Not only would you have heard it on television, radio, and any other media you consumed, you also would know many other figures ready to give a similar spiritual guidance in your local community. The only thing that makes Jordan Peterson unusual is the age he's appeared in, the late hour at which he arrives. He speaks wisdom that would work if it was followed, but somehow his status as a fish out of water means that it never will be followed. But as I use Nolan's analogy of the hero we needed but didn't deserve, I think the question that naturally comes about is, who is Jordan Peterson's opposite? Not the purveyor of old wisdom we need who can't seem to function in postmodernity, but instead a figure that everyone wanted to appear, a figure that breathes postmodernity like air, embodies everything it desires, but simultaneously is disconnected from anything that might be called wisdom or even a coherent solution. And in my mind, this inverted archetype is no better filled than in the YouTube sensation ContraPoints.